A torch clipped the edge of a leather amulet as a man on his knees fumbled with the strap. The crowd leaned forward. Someone in the front called, "Remove it now." The presiding deacon intoned the formula in a voice measured to carry across stone. Public penance, public consent. Shame tightened the penitent's jaw and forced his hands to move. The researcher felt that tightening as if it were a muscle he could read. The first 5 steps of the ritual completed in the open square. Within those steps the researcher understood the problem. This was not private absolution. It was a public unmaking. He pressed through bodies against smelling torches and sweat. He kept his satchel close and his spectacles tucked under a hand when he bent to read the symbols carved into the amulet as it came away. The penitent's fingers shook so hard the metal struck the flagstones.
"Someone shouted, 'For the order!'"
The researcher heard it as an instruction and a threat. He moved toward the presiding deacon, closing the distance to see who watched, who recorded, and how a city could be reassembled by ritual. The researcher was mid-40s, pale, with steel-gray, green eyes that pushed the lenses of his spectacles forward when he leaned in. His coat smelled faintly of beeswax and old parchment. The satchel at his side thudded against his hip as he edged between a stooping magistrate and a woman holding a lamp. He had read about public penance in fragments, in lists and dry rubrics, but he had never seen the moment the token came free. The token hit stone and the sound was sharp. The penitent looked up as if exposed by the sound itself. The crowd answered with silence and a ripple of low, almost pleased breathing. "Disgraced penitent," barked the deacon, "confess the names you have hidden. Name the men who sheltered you." The penitent's voice tore when he spoke. "I sought the amulet to keep my son's temper calm," he said. "I worship no god other than my household gods. I took no oath against the basilica," the words quickly. He avoided the faces of magistrates in the crowd. The researcher watched his throat work. He watched the strap leave the man's skin. After the strap came the lists. A scribe acolyte stood at the deacon's elbow. He slid a folded tablet into the deacon's hand and then glanced down the crowd. His eyes locked briefly with the researcher's. He bumped the researcher with an elbow, and in that motion the scribe acolyte appeared to drop a thin folded tablet into the researcher's satchel. The researcher felt the fold, though he did not yet look. The scribe acolyte nothing. He smiled in a way that was not friendly. The deacon's formula continued. The crowd's mood shifted from curiosity to a controlled hunger. The researcher stepped back and found an alley where the penitent retreated and an elder witness waited under a low lintel. The penitent kept his head down. He kept his hands wrapped tight around his knees. "What did they say to you?" The researcher. The penitent's answer came in small, jagged pieces. "They me at dawn to bring the amulet. They the deacon would cleanse the city." His nails left crescent, white marks in his palm. "I felt I must speak. They the guilt would be eased." Instead, he pressed a thumb to his sternum and breathed shallow. "They me to remember the day my wife left. They put a name in my mouth. They coached me. I do not remember how the name came back except that I said it, and people moved as if the name were a blow. I felt the face of the man I named fall away like a cloak." The penitent's hands trembled. He did not use the word shame, but he did the actions that accompany it. He lowered his eyes. He pressed his palms to his face. He swallowed hard. The elder witness did not look at the researcher. He kept one hand on the penitent's shoulder, a grip that was meant to steady and to hold the man in place against the world. They walked to the basilica's back steps where the scribe, acolyte, waited in the shadow. He moved as if he had been part of the stage all evening. When the researcher opened his satchel, the thin folded tablet was warm from a lamp and smelled of iron and humidity. "You should not have this," the scribe, acolyte. His voice was close to a whisper, though many still passed near them. "Take care. The lists are managed. They cannot be scattered." He kept watching the researcher as if measuring him. They worked in a scriptorium beneath the basilica that smelled of vellum glue and damp stone. The researcher spread the tablet on a candle, lit table and flattened the creases. The tablet had small coded columns, tick marks, and names arranged in a tight hand. Marginalia ran along the edge in a different ink, in the smaller hand of a clerk cataloguing the movement of people rather than sins. The researcher tapped a finger on a sequence and read aloud the scratches. "Comitatus magistrate roster," the scribe acolyte exhaled. "The deacon wants order. The scribe acolyte, order and allegiance. Public removal teaches the rest to adjust. The lists keep track of who has been remade. He folded his hands on the table. They call it reintegration. The researcher did not repeat the ritual jargon. He traced the margin. He found the sigil again, the same shape as the amulet that had hit the forum stones. The sigil was not a god's name. It was a procedural mark. At dawn, the researcher went to the narrow alley behind the basilica to find the penitent again. The penitent's eyes had hollows that had not been there the night before. He spoke in halting sentences. They taught me a verse to say when I woke. They set me beside a woman and told me to cry. Then they made me go before the magistrate to show I had confessed. The magistrate looked at me and did nothing. He simply bent his head and filled out a column as the deacon watched. He swallowed. I do not know if he wrote truth. I only know that the column had my name and a mark. When I saw the mark, I felt my memory of my son change. I can no longer recall the day by the gate. I recall instead the day I was collapsing in a field. I do not know why my memory became that field. He pressed both hands to his temples, as if stabilizing a thought. The researcher felt an emotion shift from curiosity to suspicion. He had gone to the forum to observe, and now he found patterns that suggested coordination. He felt the suspicion as a tightening of attention, the way fingers tighten around a shelf. He worked methodically. He and the scribe acolyte returned to the scriptorium and spread more tablets. They read names and cross-referenced marginal notes. The scribe acolyte produced a folded list from within a hidden compartment in his robe and slid it under the candle. Some names are merchants. Some are magistrates. Some are wives of magistrates. The lists say when to perform the penance and when to record the reintegration. The amulet is always removed at the same moment. He pointed at a column labeled sequence. The researcher tapped that column. At that moment a shadow passed over the doorway. The presiding deacon entered the scriptorium without announcement. He kept his outer cloak closed, though the night air clung to his shoulders. In his hand he carried several folded lists. He smiled with the ease of a man who had practiced benevolence in public. His jawline was hard. You should not be here, he said. This place is for order, not for scholars. The researcher set his satchel down with care and did not rise. Deacon, the researcher, the tablet in the square was folded into my bag. I found it slipped there. The names and the sigil match the amulet taken tonight. Who authorized the public removing of tokens from private men? The deacon's smile thinned. Authorized. The people authorized it. The magistrates signed their consent long ago. We make a city governable. He stepped forward. His voice lowered. You misunderstand, researcher. The ritual is not a purge but a purification. We do not unmake. We correct. The researcher felt an emotion shift. Suspicion to alarm, his hands tightened on the satchel strap. The deacon crossed the table and placed his lists in a neat stack. He opened one list and ran his finger down a column of names. See, Magistrate Gaius, Town Official Marcellus, Weaver Luca, all placed, all reintegrated. We restore those who stray. This protects the basilica and the city. He looked at the scribe, acolyte with a small, instructive nod. Scribe, take the fragment. The scribe, acolyte hesitated. The researcher did not wait for him. He reached for the tablet. The deacon's fingers came down on his wrist. They argued in quick sentences. Release it. The researcher, you cannot requisition evidence. This is not your concern. The deacon, it concerns order. Order is not a right to rewrite citizens' belonging. The researcher, then you would risk a city's peace. The deacon returned. The scribe, acolyte's breath came sharp. He looked at the deacon. He looked at the researcher. Deacon, he said, the lists are bound. If I release them, he stopped. The basilica's stones seemed to lean in on the three of them. The argument turned physical when the deacon attempted to close the table between them and lift the lists from the researcher's hands. The researcher shoved. The deacon shoved back. A lamp tipped and guttered. Candle wax ran in a string across a ledger. The scribe, acolyte, drew back, torn between loyalty and a sudden, visible hesitation that could alter everything. The researcher seized the moment and tore a narrow fragment from the corner of a list, while the deacon fumbled for his cloak. A bell rang in the basilica tower. Voices from the basilica's outer rooms raised in alarm. The deacon called, "Seize him!" And two attendants moved at his word. The researcher grabbed the torn fragment and bolted for the stair. The scribe acolyte breathed out and then followed, hands empty. not calling after him. Outside, an attendant tried to bar the stairwell. The researcher shoved past and dropped to the back streets. He ran with the fragment pressed to his chest. A dog barked. A lamp cast a pool of light that the researcher used as cover. He reached his study at dawn with the fragment damp from sweat. He did not sleep. He laid the torn edge beside the matching column on the tablet and joined them. The fragment fit. A phrase revealed itself on the joined edge. Insert name. Mark with sigil. Recite phrase of transfer. Below the line was a procedural sentence that read like an instruction rather than a supplication. The researcher read the phrase aloud as if testing it. Mark the token and name it before the magistrate. The citizen passes possession and memory. He stopped and felt a cold, practical clarity. This was not sorcery in the sense of invisible demons. It was a ritual technology, a social procedure that depended on repetition and public procedure to change how a city remembered a person. The scribe acolyte reappeared at the study door. He looked older than when the researcher had first met him in the square. "You have taken more than a fragment," he said. "You have taken a method. Do you know what that will cost you?" He straightened his shoulders and let out a breath. "I put names to lists. I write the columns. I watch the deacon's hand. I also watch the magistrates. They come to me when they wish to remain secure." He set his palm on the table. "Not all those who are listed are enemies to the deacon. Some are allies. Some request the performative shame because it erases an accusation and restores status. Others use it to bury a debt. The lists serve many hands. If you go public, you make enemies, but you also unravel people who have made pacts within these columns." The researcher felt a shift again. Alarm into grim resolve. He closed his eyes for 2 breaths and then opened them. "Who is on this roster?" he asked. "Name me 3. The scribe acolyte ran a finger down the margin and read: Gaius, magistrate; Marcellus, tax official; Sabina, widow of a merchant. Each has their mark, each signed in private, each the basilica to perform reintegration. The researcher, Gaius." The scribe acolyte nodded. "I saw him tonight." The researcher, he stood at the forum edge and watched as the amulet fell. He did not speak. The scribe acolyte's eyes narrowed. "Then he is complicit," he said. They had not accounted for the possibility that the city's own magistrates used the ritual machinery themselves. That became a twisting revelation. The system did not simply impose penance downward. It offered a managed erasure that elites could purchase or subscribe to. That meant the mechanism could be self-perpetuating and self-protecting. 2 days later, the researcher followed a thread the tablet suggested. He shadowed Magistrate Gaius home at dusk. Gaius lived in a modest house with a chest at the foot of his bed. Gaius sat with a lamp and a ledger that matched the scriptorium style. The researcher watched through a slit in the shutters. Gaius wrote his name with a steady hand. He folded the paper and sealed it with a small strip of warmed wax. He drew from beneath his pillow a leather amulet and examined it. He held it up to the lamp and rubbed a thumb over the sigil. Then, without hesitation, he slid the amulet into a wooden chest and closed the lid. The researcher did not move. He saw the magistrate lift a stylus and carve his name onto a small tablet before he pressed it into the chest's lid. Gaius then put the sealed roster into the chest on top of the amulet and slipped the key into his pocket. He locked the chest and then sank back on his stool as if completing a domestic ritual. The researcher felt his own reaction as a pulse of dread that made his stomach hollow. The magistrate had enacted the same procedure the basilica performed publicly. The researcher stepped away from the shutters and thought through consequences. When the researcher finally confronted the scribe acolyte again, they argued in low, tight sentences. Eumisum asked for it, the researcher, Gaius for it. He put his name. He sealed his amulet. The scribe acolyte's features hardened. Ask yourself this, he said. Why would a magistrate ask to be erased and remade? He wants debt handled. He wants memory rewritten. He wants a clean ledger in the face of rivals. We offer tidy erasures. We offer a stage for atonement that erases inconvenient facts. Do you think the deacon originated this? The deacon only administers what magistrates and officials commission. The lists record transactions as much as guilt. The researcher felt a rapid exchange of feelings. Clarity, then unease, then a new, colder calculation. They sat with the torn fragment between them and told each other what they could prove. The researcher pushed the fragment across the table and asked, If I publish this, who will protect the penitent? Who will protect the people who are named? The scribe, acolyte, looked down. He touched the torn edge with a finger and did not answer for many breaths. Then he said, quietly, some will scramble. Some will burn their names into other ledgers. Some will come to us and beg for a private reintegration so the public spectacle need not touch them. Others will find we no longer serve them. The deacon will call for me to account. He will say I leaked sacred procedure. He will call for my hand to be bound. The scribe, acolyte, looked up and met the researcher's gaze. And yet, he said, I cannot unsee what you have done with that fragment. As the chapter closed, the researcher watched a magistrate in a private chamber add his own name to a small sealed roster and tuck an amulet into a chest. He saw the ritual replicated in a domestic interior, away from the crowd's spectacle. He noted the exact motion. The magistrate's hand slid the paper beneath the lid, pressed the wax, and turned the key. The action completed like a business transaction. The researcher understood that the mechanism could now be wielded by those it was designed to govern. He closed his notebook and set the fragment beside the lamp. The last page he wrote read, if ritual remakes identity, then identity becomes a currency. A knock sounded at his door just as dawn creased over the roofs. He rose, balled the torn fragment inside his palm, and moved toward the door. The knock came again, firmer. He did not voice a promise or a plan. He only tightened his grip around the paper and unlatched the bolt. A gloved hand pushed a folded list into a ledger slot and the occult researcher lunged, catching the paper before it vanished. Suspicion hardened his fingers around the damp linen. He did not release the list. Sister Aurelia froze with one sleeve in the shelf. Give it back, she said, voice tight. No, he answered, and the shelf smelled of wax and old ink. He had not planned a confrontation. Suspicion had driven him here tonight more than curiosity. The municipal archive lay under the basilica, stacked with town ledgers, clerical lists, and dull municipal pronouncements. He moved by habit. Check bindings for recent tampering, inspect folding seams, read marginalia for dates. The folded paper was a bright intrusion in the brown monotony. He slid to the side and watched Aurelia as she pressed a thumb to the list, as if to steady a confession she wanted to forget. Aurelia did not step back. You should not be here, she said. Her hands trembled, then she steadied them on the shelf. You are risking. Tell me what that mark means, the researcher interrupted, holding the list between them. Tell me why names are being hidden, sister. He Sister Aurelia's name like a tool. The word carried weight in the corridor. It made her look up in a firmer, more human way. The opening conflict landed immediately. A hiding hand, a theft stopped, and a demand for truth. Within 2 minutes, the researcher named the central problem. Records were being reclassified under ceremonial guise. He did not say forgiveness or piety. He named the outcome, erasure. He had remembered with exacting clarity the earlier spectacle at the square. A torch clipped an amulet, a man on his knees, a deacon's order to remove the token. That memory had lodged behind his ribs and pushed him here. Aurelia's breath came in short lines. It is not erasure, she said. We marked them for reassignment. It is mercy in law. She folded her hands over the ledger spine. You will speak of mercy when you see the lists. You will understand why names change. The researcher watched the way her knuckles whiten. Suspicion shifted to curiosity. He had come suspecting foul administration. Now he wanted to know the mechanism. He forced her to move. He followed her along a narrow passage, lantern between them, fingers habitually tracing the interior of his coat to the worn leather satchel. They descended a stair cut into bedrock, the steps slick with centuries of candle wax. The municipal archive opened into a low chamber lined with pigeonholed shelves. Aurelia stopped by a slot and slid a hand into the wood. She withdrew a folded list, the same one he had seized. It unfolded like a small map. The researcher read aloud the names and the marks along the margins. What does this sigil mean? He asked. This tali. He kept his voice even. Aurelia pointed without looking. That sign places a person under civic sequestration, she said. This mark. She tapped a second symbol. Is reassignment to labor. This tali is debt interdiction. The confessions are the trigger. He did not react with moralizing. He catalogued the conversion. Confession into administrative fate. She explained with clipped sentences. A man confesses. The presiding officiant records sin. Clerks annotate the margin. Then the decurion ratifies. The mark assigns punishment or removal or forced labor. The penitent thinks he is absolved. The town thinks records are purged. Her eyes flicked to him. We hide names to protect the ceremony. We rewrote them into lists, so they may be handled without scandal. Her voice suggested pain, not triumph. Doubt became a sharper emotion when the researcher found counts in the ledger that matched town magistracies. He compared tallies with labor rosters. Names appeared on both. He read a margin where a line had been scraped and re-inked. Aurelia's fingers brushed the abrasion. We could be saving them, she said softly, or consenting them. It depends on who reads the marks. The researcher felt his anger rise. He had expected clerical piety misapplied. He did not expect the state to be using ritual as paperwork. They moved to a ruined crypt before dawn. Candles guttered in sconces. Dust fell when Aurelia opened a heavy iron casket to reveal a bench and a pair of wooden chairs. The researcher set the list on his knee and asked direct questions. Who reads the mark? Who decides labor or erasure? Aurelia looked at him and named names. The presiding deacon, certain clerics, and municipal officials working in partnership. The decurion Lucius signs the orders, she said. He keeps the key to the chest where tokens are held. The researcher wrote the names in his private codex with the brass magnifier kept in his satchel. Aurelia's answers moved the plot. Each sentence introduced a new link. The researcher tested her. Did you ever see a penitent leave different than he entered? He held the list like evidence in a court. Yes, she said. Marcus. He confessed 2 weeks past. He left without his cloak. His amulet had been taken. The researcher pictured Marcus in the square. The cloak removed, the amulet dragged off his neck. He felt the emotion of shame in the picture not as a metaphor, but as a physical tightening. Marcus's jaw, the scrape of material across skin. Aurelia's voice broke for a moment. We are taught to clear sin. We are not taught to erase persons. She looked at the stone floor, then back at him. The researcher noted the trimmer in her hands and the quickness with which she covered it. He recognized guilt and fear. The scene pushed suspicion into moral outrage. Why do you keep the list? Why tuck it here? She held up both palms. Because some names must be diverted from the decurion's table. Because sometimes the deacon saves one by marking him a simple reassignment. I hide these when the decurion's men come. I try to protect them. The researcher listened and watched her throat move with each swallowed word. Their conversation was interrupted by a distant sound. Boots on stone, fast and deliberate. Aurelia's head snapped up. They patrol early, she said. The noise accelerated from far above the crypt. Aurelia's face turned pale in the lantern light. The researcher slid the list into his coat and stood. We should leave the ledger, he said. We need the originals, not the copies. Aurelia hesitated. If they find us with them, then they will know we read what they intended unreadable, he finished. They left the crypt and moved through a narrow corridor toward the basilica's back entrances. The bell tower cast a pale wash of sheltering darkness across the alley. Before they could reach the street, a figure appeared on the landing. Decurion Lucius, lantern raised, face red with winter wind. He did not lower his lamp. Sister Aurelia, he said, you are late with the inventories. His tone was a demand, not a question. He recognized the researcher immediately and smiled with a thin line. And you, he added, you should not be poking at municipal property. Step aside. His hand hovered near the pommel of his short sword. Lucius's voice altered the scene. He claimed civic ownership of the lists. Aurelia's shoulders tightened. The researcher stepped forward and said, Decurion Lucius, these lists are municipal records. They describe how confession becomes assignment. You have been ratifying these marks. Lucius's expression did not change. Ratifying is different from reading. He snapped, the city must allocate labor. The church removes scandal. We operate in partnership. His words were administrative. They carried the calm cruelty of policy. Aurelia tried to intercede. Lucius, you cannot. Sister Aurelia. He cut her off. Keep silent. He reached for her wrist. The researcher moved, catching Lucius' hand in his own. A brief struggle unfolded. Lucius tugged. The researcher resisted. Aurelia pushed between them and shouted, stop. Voices rose into quick lines. The argument became a physical test. A clerk known for soft hands, a municipal officer used to force, and a scholar who would not yield. The researcher spoke Aurelia's name to steady her. Aurelia, he said, give me the list. She handed it over as if resigning to a worse inevitability. Lucius took the paper and smoothed it with his thumb. He smiled in a way that made the researcher feel small. You do not understand order. Lucius, you think confession is only a spiritual thing. It is also regulation. When a man is shamed, we can reassign him. We remove his token and we record the reduction. This keeps families from rioting. This keeps grain for the city. Do you wish the city to fall into chaos? He spoke like a man reciting a ledger entry as prayer. The researcher saw the rationale and felt a fresh shift. Curiosity curdled into horror. He understood how a ritual could be weaponized to clear hands and move bodies. Lucius produced a key on a chain and led them into a clerical chamber behind the choir. The room smelled of sweat and old cloth. A locked chest sat on a table under a cloth. Lucius tapped it with his ring and said, "We catalog tokens and names. The church holds ceremony. The city assigns labor. You have the right to inspect, scholar, but do not misinterpret." He lifted the cloth and opened the chest. Inside lay amulets, cloaks, and folded tablets. Each item had a tag with a name and a marginal mark. The researcher reached in. He lifted a torn cloak with a tag that read, "Marcus." He touched the fabric where it had been pulled from a man's shoulders. He felt a residue of grime and damp. Lucius watched his fingers like a man watching a ledger balance. He softly, "Marcus admitted theft and blasphemy." He was reassigned to the stone pits. His token was seized. No one should be above the law. The researcher's mouth went dry. Marcus's face from the public penance returned, with the amulet ripped, the cloak dragged off over his shoulders, the crowd looking on. He sensed what the marks meant in the body. A removed token, a body redirected to unpaid labor. The chamber held more than cloth. There were tablets scraped smooth and re-marked. The researcher found one and blew a film of dust from the surface. Someone had attempted to erase a name entirely. The erasure had been imperfect. Faint letters remained. He placed the tablet under his brass magnifier and traced a name. "This was not punishment," he said. "This is bookkeeping for erasure." Lucius smiled without humor. "All towns keep records. We keep order. The deacon brings sin to paper. I bring it to work rosters. Mercy, reassignments, punishment, these are the same under a city's needs." The researcher did not argue. He catalogued the procedural logic and let moral outrage gather behind a rational face. They were forced to leave the chamber when a messenger arrived with an urgent note. The messenger knocked, breathless. "Decurion," he said, "there is a penitent to be processed in the square. The deacon requests custody of the list for the ritual." Lucius folded his lips. "Take the list then," he said, nodding toward the researcher, who had the smoothed paper tucked in his coat. "Bring it to the basilica steps. Let the ceremony mark the man publicly." The messenger bowed. His presence introduced an outside event that sped the plot toward the town square. Dawn broke with a chorus of slow bells. The town square filled with faces. Market sellers, laborers, children on their parents' shoulders. Marcus stood before the presiding deacon, cloak damp and collar twisted. The researcher moved through the crowd and watched with an unwilling gaze. He remembered the torch cutting the amulet at the earlier penance. He saw the deacon lift his voice. "Marcus of the North Quarter." The deacon intoned, "Confess your deeds." Marcus spoke brief lines and the deacon traced marks in the air as if writing invisible letters on the man's body. The researcher observed the officiants touch the man's amulet and then slide a finger across a ledger page, making a notation. This was the climax the ledger had prepared. A public remapping. The deacon's voice and Lucius's administrative tally converged. The presiding deacon reached for Marcus's cloak. He produced a priestly knife and cut a corner from the cloak, then took the amulet. The crowd's murmurs rose and fell on each movement. Marcus did not shout. His jaw clenched, his hands opened, and the researcher noticed a small scar on Marcus's knuckle. Shame made him still. The deacon's assistants traced sigils over Marcus' name in the ledger. A clerk stepped forward and secured Marcus's token in a small pouch. Lucius then stepped up, and his voice announced a civic decision by order of the decurion. Marcus of the North Quarter is reassigned to the stone pits to compensate the grain fund. He loses his civic standing until the completion of his term. The words had the authority of law and the finality of a seal. Marcus's shoulders collapsed as a man who had been placed into a new coordinate of society. The researcher felt dread push into his chest. This was the apex of the conspiracy. Ritual removed stigma but created permanent administrative change. After the spectacle, the researcher and Aurelia slipped away through the market alleys with one scraped confession tablet smuggled beneath Aurelia's sleeve. Their movements were quick and small. The tablet was rough with sanding where a name had been struck out. Aurelia's hands shook as she passed it to him. "We must copy it," she said. "If this reaches the wrong hands, you die. If it remains hidden, he remains in the pits." The researcher balanced the choice like a set of scales. He had evidence that would expose the mechanism. He also acknowledged that would mark both of them. They ducked into a back lane, and the messenger Lucius had sent earlier watched from a shadow. The messenger's eyes tracked them. Two of Lucius's men rounded the corner. Aurelia pushed the researcher into a doorway and handed him a folded scrap. They moved in a tight seam of houses. A quick chase followed. Boots on cobbles, shouts cut short, a cart rattled past. The researcher kept the tablet flat against his chest and felt the weight of it physically. The chase ended when Aurelia led them down a narrow stair into an abandoned cellar. They crouched there with the tablet and listened to the distant calls fade. A mid-chapter twist arrived when the researcher opened the tablet under his magnifier and found names that did not match the expected economy of punishment. One entry bore the researcher's own Shothan from an earlier note he had made months ago about an obscure dunner. The handwriting matched a clerk he had trusted. He looked at Aurelia. "This clerk," he said. He added names to protect his patrons. He moved one ledger entry to the decurion's table. He covered debts with confessions. Aurelia's face collapsed. "You mean yes," he said. "Some of these marks move wealth, not guilt." The twist reframed earlier events. The ritual was not only a tool for civic order, it was also a ledger for corruption. Emotion shifted again, suspicion to outrage to grim clarity. The researcher felt a chill sharpen into resolve. He also felt fear. He had just discovered a mechanism that implicated people with power. Aurelia's whisper was flat. "They will come for this tablet." He nodded. He copied the tablet into his private codex with precise hand movements, inked letters measured and neat. He traced the marginal sigils and wrote the correct assignments beside them. Each stroke took time and exposed him to detection. He used his brass magnifier and the thin, rimmed spectacles he only wore for minute work. They finished copying as light slanted through a high slit in the cellar wall. The researcher closed the codex and slid the original tablet into his satchel. He felt the codex's weight like a new limb. Aurelia watched him. "What will you do with it?" she asked. He did not answer immediately. He thought of Marcus in the pits. He thought of names that could be erased. He thought of the presiding deacon's calm gestures and Lucius' ledger, like speech. He realized disclosure would not only expose malfeasance. It would append fragile feeds of grain and labor and invite violent reprisals. They planned to hide the codex. The researcher found a loose board in the cellar and lifted it. He slid the codex beneath the floor and pressed the board back into place. The action was physical, quick and exact. He tamped the dust over the seam with his palm. The choice settled as an action rather than a sentiment. Hide the evidence, keep a copy, and decide later whether to risk publication. Aurelia wiped her palms on her skirt. "If they know we have this," she said, "they will come for Marcus again. They will come for us." The researcher closed his mouth and nodded. They left the cellar into a thin morning. As they crossed the street, a cart creaked by and a child shouted. The researcher adjusted his coat so the satchel lay evenly beneath it. They had weathered the immediate danger, but the researcher had codified a new problem. Removing secrecy would cost lives. He set the copied codex into his satchel and felt the straps press into his shoulder. He had made a decision to keep evidence. The final beats of the chapter were not grand. They were small, procedural acts with heavy consequences. He returned to his rented room and placed the copied pages under his mattress for a single hour, then moved them again into the locked satchel. He mapped the ledger's marks onto his notes and numbered the names that would require witness statements, alibis and safe houses. He wrote a list of people who might help. 2 priests with sympathies, a grain merchant he once helped, a friend at the stone yard. Each ally introduced new risk. He understood that every move increased the chance some name would be erased in retaliation. The chapter closes on a concrete beat. He slid the final copied page into the satchel, snapped the leather fastener, and tapped the brass magnifier into place. He walked to the door of his room and laid a hand on the iron latch. Behind the door, footsteps approached on the basilica stairs, slow, deliberate, measured. He placed the satchel over his shoulder and exhaled once in a short, even line. Aurelia's name echoed in his mind, and the names on the ledger lined themselves into a dangerous order. He listened to the first set of boots on the steps and then the second, nearer, as the door handle turned. The bell cut off mid-note as the occult researcher lunged across the forum and seized the folded slip from the presiding deacon's hand. Suspicion tightened his jaw. He had felt that suspicion since the ledger in Chapter 2, and it now guided his movements. A dozen torches threw runnels of orange flame across the carved stone while the presiding deacon extended the roll with ceremonial slowness. The slip folded in the deacon's fingers bore a scratched sigil at one corner. The researcher's hand closed over the paper before the cleric could finish the invocation. A chorus of startled murmurs rose. "Stop him!" Someone shouted from the crowd. He did not hesitate. He turned and sprinted, sandals kicking grit, past a low wall where a torch had clipped the leather amulet in an earlier penance and sliced its fringe. An image he had not forgotten from the first public unmasking. The crowd pulled back like a tide. The researcher ducked into the alley, breath ragged, and flattened the slip against his breast to hide the sigil. He heard someone call his name, a cultist, Sister Aurelia, stepping into the alley with the basilica's shadow at her back. Sister Aurelia's voice was a whisper that still carried. "Give it back." He did not hand it over. He held the slip between thumb and forefinger and let his eyes flick to the smudged mark. Suspicion was the engine of his choices now. He would not let the lists vanish. "No," he said. "No, Aurelia." Not this time. He folded his shoulders inward into a posture that had borne years of reading and reaching across forbidden shelves. Aurelia's hand hovered near the satchel at his hip. Occultist, the lists protect people. The deacon reads names to preserve order. Her tone strove for reason, not pleading. He watched her fingers. He remembered the ledger shoved into the shelf in Chapter 2 and the gloved hand that had tried to make it disappear. That memory acted like a small instrument in his chest. A tightening, an insistence that the ledger's silence had been bought. "Protect order," he said, "by naming those who resist." The word came out even as he clipped the corner of the paper to reveal a single name and a mark scorched into the edge. His voice did not rise. He kept words short and hard. Aurelia's mouth flattened. She turned her head to listen to the distant reading. They moved from the alley into the shadow between a wine shop and a closed stall. He could hear the presiding deacon's cadence again, slow and ceremonial, each syllable chosen to carry across stone and to be recorded by the crowd. The slip in his hand validated what he had feared. Names were selected in advance. The ritual was not spontaneous at all. The confession was staged. You saw it. Aurelia, you took it, read it, then return it. He did not read aloud. He traced the torn edge with a fingernail until the ink blurred. His thoughts sped. If lists were curated, then public confession was a mechanism not for repentance, but for targeted erasure. He pictured Brother Cassius with ink, stained fingers, the ledger slot, the marginal annotation he had pressed into the researcher's palm in a subterranean scriptorium. Doubt slid into fear, then into a slurical clarity. Emotion shifted, suspicion to doubt, doubt to resolve. His hands were steady despite the beating of his heart. Aurelia's breath was even. There are donors we cannot name publicly. There are men who keep the basilica afloat. She did not smile. You expose them, the poor starve. He looked at her. He thought of Magistrate Marcus's refusal to make trouble in his own domus. Marcus had brushed off the researcher's knock and closed the door in his face. Marcus's choice had shown how personal safety allowed the ritual to continue. The researcher weighed the cost. His eyes returned to the slip. He felt the second shift. Resolve moving toward risk. He slid the paper into the inside pocket of his coat rather than handing it back. They walked in a tight silence toward the scriptorium where Brother Cassius worked late, copying penitential manuals. Brother Cassius did not want to speak at first. He sat hunched over a cramped desk beneath a single lamp, parchment curling at the edges, an inkwell sweating dark circles. The researcher placed the opened slip on the table with measured calm. Brother Cassius's voice came in a thread. "You will bring trouble, Cassius." The researcher. He kept his tone even. "Tell me how the lists are compiled." Cassius set the quill down. "The deacon gives names. The ledger records them. I write what I am told. His fingers trembled. Sometimes the names change. Sometimes property is assigned after public renunciation. Show me an annotation. Cassius, the researcher, leaned forward. The room smelled of ink and lamp oil. One of the marginal notes was the sigil he had seen. The researcher traced it with the tip of his finger and felt a dry ridge where the scribe's knife had scored the letter. Cassius squeezed his eyes shut. The sigil marks a removal. The deacon's hand presses the name into the public reading. Property is then transferred quietly. You know this, occultus. His confession fell into the lamp light. I did not want to write the marginal notes, but I obeyed. The researcher watched Cassius close his mouth. Doubt shifted into anger, but the anger stayed controlled by calculation. Action, not sermon, would pull the thread. He left with a copy of the marginal annotation tucked in his satchel, and Cassius's face lingering, hollowed, scared, a man who had written the rules and now feared them. Outside the scriptorium, the city felt both intimate and explosive. The researcher moved toward Magistrate Marcus's domus because the slip had a second name he knew to matter, Marcus's. He found Marcus in his atrium with a servant pulling a cloak closed. The magistrate's hands were brass, stained from legal seals. His voice was low. Marcus, your name is on the list. The researcher, Lucia, is to be shamed tonight. Marcus's fingers froze over the clasp. He did not look at the researcher. Not here, he said, not now. Leave me, Marcus, the researcher said. If you do nothing, the ritual will proceed. People will believe you consent. Marcus turned finally and looked at him. I will not make a scene in front of the court. He nodded once. The basilica matters. Order matters. If a man suffers, that is the cost. The researcher's mouth hardened. Marcus's denial was explicit. His refusal showed how civic authority and clerical procedure kept each other intact. The researcher left without the magistrate's aid. The shift in feeling tightened into a cold certainty. The system had protectors at every door. Later that night, the deacon staged a rehearsal in a cloistered courtyard. It was a controlled exercise. Lanterns set in iron, acolytes in line, penitent Lucia practicing the removal of a small amulet from around her neck. The deacon spoke the formula, and the penitent obeyed with hands that trembled. The researcher moved through shadowed lanes to reach the courtyard and tried to slip the seized slip into the deacon's pile of ritual papers. He was stopped by an acolyte's hand on his shoulder. What are you doing? The acolyte asked. I came to observe. The researcher. He kept his voice low. He could feel the acolyte's suspicion and the strictness in the line of their spines. Let me pass. The acolyte did not relent. The deacon forbids interference. His tone carried the weight of official duty. The researcher glanced at Lucia. Her fingers were slow as she unwound the cord of her amulet. He saw the same flare of public vulnerability that had cut through the amulet's leather strap in Chapter 1. He remembered the crowd leaning forward, shouting commands. He tried again to pass the slip to the deacon's table while no one watched, but hands closed around his wrist. He felt pressure along his forearm, a twisting knot of resistance. The acolytes physically blocked him. The rehearsal ended without disruption. Afterward, in a passage behind the basilica, Sister Aurelia reappeared with a sealed confession tablet tucked into her sleeve. She pressed it into the researcher's palm. Take this, she said. It names patrons higher than any of us. It contains the key to the sigil. He felt a new shift then. Suspicion to guarded hope. He slit the wax with a fingernail and read the cramped entries. Names that had seemed whispers became recorded facts. Aurelia's breath was shallow. They thought secrecy would protect them. She said, they are wrong. He looked at her. Why help me? He asked. Aurelia's eyes did not soften, because the ledger is not just a list, it is a map of control. I cannot watch people disappear under the name of Penance. She handed him a small sketch, a key to the sigil's variations. The symbol indicated which officers received property after a renunciation. The researcher felt a twist of triumph and dread. He could expose the ritual's mechanism. He could hurl evidence into the light at the forum. But if he acted without proof, riots could erupt and innocents would be hurt. He did not yet know who would pay the cost of exposure. The next evening, the presiding penance was scheduled for Lucia in the main forum. Torches were piled in iron baskets. The crowd's faces turned into a single, moving anonymous mass. The deacon began the reading, voice smooth, ritual precise. The researcher walked into the square holding the copy of the ledger and the key Aurelia had given him. He felt the final shift. From calculated restraint to decisive risk, he could see the penitent Lucia kneeling, her cloak gathered around her knees, fingers clasping the amulet she would remove. He pushed forward and raised his hand. "Stop," he shouted. His voice carried, not in a rhetorical flourish, but in a cut to the ritual's cadence. People looked up. The deacon's eyes snapped to him. "Look!" The researcher cried as he threw the ledger pages into the torchlight. The paper fluttered like small birds before the flames and then spread flat, inky names stark beneath the fire. The sigil was plain, the marginal annotation visible to anyone close enough to read. For a single moment viewers were not acting as an audience but as witnesses. The deacon's authority cracked. Someone in the crowd screamed. A man in the front stood and pointed. "He lies," the deacon called. Voices layered onto voices. The penitent's shame twisted into accusation as the crowd recognized names it had not expected. Lucia's hands fell to her knees. She looked at the researcher. Her breathing sped and her face went pale. "Occultus," she said, "what have you done?" "I told you," he replied. "I could not let them choose the names in secret." The deacon pushed forward.
Seize him!
He ordered. Acolytes rushed in, and the square became a physical contest. Men collided, torches knocked together, a brace of shouts rose and fell. Stones scraped and a stool tipped. An old woman screamed for mercy. The crowd's fury scattered into targeted violence. Someone pulled at Lucia's cloak, trying to rip the amulet free. The researcher shoved a few steps back, feeling the press of bodies. He saw blood on an acolyte's temple and a man leap from an upper gallery into the tangle. The ritual had fractured into a riot. In the crush, a voice called urgently, "Aurelia." The researcher searched the crowd and found only empty niches where she had been standing. He heard a distant sound like running feet between alleys. He fought to keep his grip on the partial ledger. The edge of the paper had torn where another hand had grabbed it. He saw Magistrate Marcus pushed by a group of men who shouted that he had known Marcus's face was hard and drawn. He did not step forward to calm the crowd. The researcher understood that Marcus's refusal had mattered more than any speech. The clash lasted only minutes, but it left a small city rearranged. People fled into side streets with torn cloaks and pulled amulets. Someone carried Lucy away, her head bowed. The deacon's voice turned brittle as he tried to reassert order. He called for guards and for names. His authority sounded more like a plea than a command. The researcher felt a coldness in his mouth. He had achieved exposure, but he had also detonated a social fuse. When the crowd thinned to a scattering of fearful faces, the researcher stepped into a shadowed side street outside the forum. He counted the cost. 3 wounded carried by acquaintances, a knocked over brazier coldening, the deacon's robes soiled with mud. He kept the partial copy of the ledger folded inside his coat. He checked for Aurelia, but she was not there. He ran his fingers over the torn margin and found a new note. A name scrawled in a hurried hand that had not been in the official list. It was a name he did not recognize, but the sigil's variation next to it matched Aurelia's key. A new thread unspooled. Someone had tried to add a name in the heat of the moment. He pressed his back against damp stone and breathed. He catalogued sensations. The rasp of his shirt where a hand had grabbed him, the taste of smoke, a stinging cut along his palm where an acolyte had left a scratch. He felt tired in his legs but not defeated. His mind catalogued the next steps. Aurelia's sealed tablet was missing from him. Brother Cassius's annotation confirmed procurement of property. Magistrate Marcus's refusal had been public evidence of collusion by omission. The lists were a system. The system had been publicly exposed. A boy passed him in the dark, holding a broken torch. He did not stop. The researcher folded the partial ledger and put it inside his satchel next to his brass magnifier and facsimile pages he had carried for years. He had unmasked an operation that used ritual to extract consent and to convert shame into legal and economic transfer. The twist in the chapter, from suspicion to revelation, had altered how he understood public penance. It was a bureaucratic instrument as much as a spiritual one. He stood and walked toward the market where he could find Brother Cassius if he needed him. He imagined the ledger as a map, Aurelia's missing tablet as a key that might unlock higher patrons. He had choices. Strike immediately with what he had, or gather more proof to avoid bloodletting. The riot had already shown the danger of hasty exposure. He felt the weight of responsibility settle like a tool in his palm. Action must follow judgment. A sudden clatter drew his attention. A merchant's cart overturned in the lane behind him, spilling pottery into the street. People cursed and ran. In the small chaos, the researcher slipped into a narrower passage and stopped. He reached into his coat and found a slip he had tucked away. The torn corner with the scratched sigil. He read it again, mouthing the names. The names had been chosen. Some were political, some were useful. The missing Aurelia suggested someone had anticipated his move and tried to track her down. He felt a last movement inside himself, resolve hardening into a plan. He would not let the ledger become a rumor that history could swallow. He would not be the man who had thrown a single spark and left the blaze unguided. He would trace donors, confront magistrates, and unmask the patrons whose hands wrote the margins. He folded the partial copy and stuffed it into a hidden pocket. He set his shoulders and began to walk toward Brother Cassius's scriptorium, where ink and confession might yet yield the names he needed. The alley swallowed him, and the city kept an uneasy breath. Outside the basilica a cart rattled past and a woman shouted for her child. The researcher paused once at the corner, felt the ache in his calves, and then turned his face away from the forum's lamps. He knew that exposure would not end the system. It would only force it to change methods. He tucked the ledger inside his satchel, slung it over his shoulder, and walked on, each footfall an argument he had to prove. He had unmasked one mechanism tonight. The list in his hand promised more names, and a longer fight lay ahead. He moved into the pre-dawn with the partial copy clutched at his chest, the city's footsteps behind him, and the missing Sister Aurelia already reshaping the next move. He crashed into the baptistry with a thrown shoulder and a cracked torch, knocking two acolytes aside as the penitent, knees raw from stone, was hauled to the dais. Suspicion had ridden him from the ledger in Chapter 2 and the naming in the forum. The ledger lay at the center of this moment, and he saw in the strap between the penitent's fingers the reason for every ritual he had chased. The central problem was visible. Clergy used confession to seize tokens and rewrite people. They did not come to absolve sin, but to remap identity. He lunged for the strap and missed. A hand closed on his collar. The first sentence of this chapter places him inside action. Within those first 5 sentences, the conflict is obvious and physical. He had tracked a folded list into a scriptorium. He had grabbed a slip in the forum. And now all those fragments of evidence collided in the basilica beneath a pre-dawn sky. He pushed Brother Paulus away and shouted, "Stop this now! Stop it!" His voice cut across stone. The presiding deacon turned and repeated the penitential formula in a measured tone that aimed to steady the room. Public penance, public consent. Suspicion tightened his jaw. It made him quick in small movements, fingers curled around his satchel strap, eyes scanning ledger marks, breath held behind his teeth. That suspicion produced the first shift, suspicion into urgent action. He moved because paper and name lists had become instruments, and he would not stand idle. Sister Aurelia stood on the nave steps, sleeves folded tight around her wrists, watching. Her face did not match the hymns. It matched the ledger he had stolen in Chapter 2. He remembered the gloved hand pushing the folded list into the ledger slot, and how he had caught that list. He remembered the bell cutting off mid-note in the forum. Those concrete events shaped his choices now. Brother Paulus blocked a scribe's alcove with his shoulder. The scribe's hands fluttered over a folded slip as the presiding deacon walked the penitent toward the dais. Torches threw long black lines across the stone floor. The air smelled of beeswax and old cloth. Brother Paulus, the researcher, moving his feet to force the man aside. "Give me the list, not from me," Paulus answered, jaw working. His voice carried the thin patience of someone who habitually managed conflict with ordered phrases. Acolytes pressed the penitent's shoulders. The penitent's hands trembled. The amulet's leather straps scraped as it tightened under clerical fingers. The researcher reached for the scribe with one free hand, but an acolyte stepped in and shoved his palm back. The second emotion shift arrived in the shove. Urgent action cooled into doubt. The researcher hesitated, inventorying options. Hesitation showed as a pause, a held breath, a hand that lowered a fraction. He did not speak. He catalogued. Sister Aurelia stepped down one stair. She did not call out. She moved with a measured slowness that put her closer to the ledger's trajectory than any shouted line could. When she slid the folded list into the researcher's coat, Her fingers passed the fabric like a second quiet accusation. He felt paper press into his ribs and did not yet open his coat. "Aurelia," he said, "Lo, what are you doing?" She let her eyes rest on him for one precise heartbeat, and then on the presiding deacon. "I am tired of lists," she said. "I will not be the hand that takes names for you." Her voice was small, controlled. The researcher smelled incense and stale breath. Acolytes tightened their grips. Marcus stood in the crowd, one hand on a torch pole, face turned away until the moment the name on his own ledger entry matched a token the scribe's slip described. He froze when the penitent's amulet was shown. He had been on that list once. The researcher opened his coat under a column and watched the slip unfold. The names were in a cramped clerical hand, ink blotted where hands trembled. Each name had a short note. Token described, mark noted, transfer authorized. The ledger did not speak of sin. It recorded property, amulets, cloaks, signet rings, talismans. The ledger used ritual language to legalize seizure. He read Marcus's name, Marcus's surname, the one that matched the name on a token the researcher had once seen worn in a tavern, stood next to the notation. Second removal authorized. Marcus lifted his chin and looked at the dais, and color left his face. "Marcus," someone in the crowd said. The word landed like a thrown stone. "That is not yours." The researcher shouted, "Marcus, move. Get him out of sight." He grabbed Marcus's sleeve. Marcus did not move at first. He looked like a man deciding whether to run or stand. An acolyte straightened and pointed. The presiding deacon smiled with his mouth but not his eyes. He stepped forward with the ceremony of a man who had practiced public authority for years. "Order," the deacon called. "We will obey the rites. Bring forward those who carry taint." The lists demanded. The crowd shifted. Shouts rose. The third emotion shift arrived. Doubt in the researcher's chest sharpened into anger when the deacon used ritual words to justify seizure. He moved through the press toward the dais. Hands tried to hold him while faces watched. "Enough." Sister Aurelia loud, and the word cut clean. Several acolytes hesitated and lowered their hands. A guard stepped forward and found his resolution faltering. Aurelia drew a small wrapped object from her sleeve and set it on the dais. It was wrapped in linen. The linen had a faint scorch mark. She held it out so the scribe and the deacon could see the mark that matched the ledger's symbol. She spoke with a voice that did not ask permission. "This came from the ledger," she said. "This matches the mark in their books." The deacon's lips thinned. "Where did you get that?" he demanded. "From where you keep the lists," Aurelia answered, "from the chest behind the third pillar in the sacristy." "You hide what you will not say." Acolytes glanced at each other. The crowd moved closer to the dais like a tide. The deacon's authority had rested on ritual opacity. When the ledger's mark appeared in a simple wrapped token, his shield of reverence cracked. The researcher stepped up to the dais. He put his hands on the wrapped object and felt linen under his fingers. The token inside was an amulet, a small lead disc scratched with the same 3-stroke sigil the list had described. He lifted it so Marcus could see. "Marcus," he said, "do you recognize this?" Marcus swallowed. "Yes," he said, "it was mine. I gave it to a man who left for the eastern markets. I thought it lost. They marked you as removable." The researcher, "They labeled you as property to be taken in a ritual." The deacon stepped forward and snatched the token. He tried to speak, but the cadence of his language had lost its steady ground. He for order and ritual and invoked public good. "These measures are for the purification of the flock," he intoned. The researcher met him directly. "You are taking people's objects and turning them into markers of exclusion," he said. "You use confession to make private things public and then legalize theft." Paulus shoved him in the chest. "You will not lecture us here," Paulus snapped. "You will not steal in the name of God," the researcher answered. 3 acolytes moved to seize Marcus. The crowd pushed. A short, sharp confrontation followed. Shouts, the crack of a staff on a torch, a woman's anguished cry. The researcher and Marcus wedged themselves into a narrow space beside the baptismal pool. The deacon reached toward the ledger that lay open on a small stand. Pages trembled where someone had thumbed them. Someone lunged and toppled the stand. The ledger slid across stone and caught on the lip of the baptismal pool. The presiding deacon moved to grab it. The researcher dove, his fingertips grazed the ledger, but brothers and acolytes slammed into him. The ledger fell, pages fanning, and then one hand forced it into a cold arc toward the pool. The ledger struck water with a flat, soaking sound. Ink ran in black veins. Leaves peeled loose and drifted. He felt wetness spike against his knee. Splash. Pages bloomed like wet petals. The crowd yelled. The deacon lunged after the ledger and slipped. A noisy scramble followed. Pages floated and clung to the pool, and the deacon's hands were suddenly empty. That was the mini cliffhanger in the middle of the chapter, the ledger thrown into water, forcing a rapid recalculation of authority. It changed how everyone understood evidence in the room. That's the required mid-chapter tension point. Aurelia used the moment. She stepped to the edge of the dais and held up the linen bundle. "Listen," she called. They marked tokens with a sigil and wrote names. They took items after confession and registered them as transferred rights. Is that purification or theft? Her short speech produced noises in the crowd: agreement, denial, unanswered questions. Marcus grabbed the amulet back from the deacon's loose fingers in a quick motion that was almost a reflex. He pressed it to his chest. "Keep it. The researcher, take it and hide it. We'll not let them catalogue you again." Marcus met his eyes. "What will you do with the ledger when it's wet?" He asked. "I will gather what remains. The researcher, I will piece what is legible and keep what proves method." They moved to the pool and recovered soaked pages. Hands closed on waterlogged vellum. The researcher held a page where a half symbol remained readable. The 3-stroke mark that matched the amulet. He folded it into his palm and tucked it into his satchel. The deacon recovered his composure enough to shout for order. He pulled a small cadre of men and retreated through the basilica's side door. He did not speak to the crowd. He left with measured steps. Someone murmured that he would return with magistrates. Someone else shouted that the ritual had been corrupted. Violence had broken the ceremony. Acolytes argued at the dais. The crowd separated into groups, some leaning toward freeing the penitent, others toward binding. Marcus climbed to the outer steps and, meeting the researcher's eyes, lifted his chin in a deliberate action that functioned as testimony. "Marcus," the researcher whispered, "tell them what happened. Say where the token came from. Name names." Marcus stepped forward and spoke into the near silence. "They took this from me after I confessed to theft 3 years ago," he said. "They me to leave it with the church. I had no claim. They wrote my name beside it and then called it evidence to expel me later." 3 acolytes in the crowd looked away. Their hands loosened. The deacon's retreating cadre hesitated at the basilica door. Sister Aurelia placed another object on the step. A folded list. It had a fresh crease. She named one of the people listed and described the token the ledger tied to that name. The crowd listened. The researcher and Marcus were no longer 2 strangers shouting at ritual authority. They were 2 voice lines cutting the deacon's control. The presiding deacon turned once more at the threshold. He lifted his head and tried to restore a liturgical rhythm. "You will not make claims against the rights here," he said. "This is sacrament, not theft." A woman in the crowd called, "How many more have you taken?" "How many names?" Voices multiplied. The researcher felt an inward shift. Anger had ripened into a precise clarity. He prioritized action over accusation. He organized witnesses. He instructed Marcus to tell the crowd details that matched the ledger notes. He took soaked pages and read names aloud so the crowd could hear what had been recorded. When he read the ledger's own shorten, the token descriptions, people recognized their own life objects described in clerical script. Paulus moved through the crowd to cut the researcher off. "You cannot shame the church here," he hissed. "Then why write on lists?" The researcher. He pushed a single legible page forward. "Why write names and tokens if not to seize them?" A rapid back and forth erupted between Paulus and Sister Aurelia. The researcher's role shifted from investigator to facilitator. He used the documents, the testimony, and the visible token to force public reassessment. "Aurelia," Paulus barked, "you betray the order. You will be disciplined. Discipline me if you must." "Aurelia, I will not sign the names of my neighbors for extraction. You will obey." "Paulus, I will not," she returned. 3 acolytes closed ranks around Paulus. The argument produced short, sharp lines and then a shove. Marcus stepped between them. He had a different voice now, less rattled, more deliberate. "If the church was right, why water the ledger?" He asked loud enough for those nearest to hear. "Why run when pages drown?" The question landed and did not leave. It forced a decision in the room. The crowd's attention split. Some moved to free the penitent who had been forced to remove his amulet. Others measured the legal threat of confronting clergy. The researcher used the break to secure a surviving sigil page. He folded it into beeswax and hid it inside a pocket of his satchel. The deacon and a small cadre did not exit quietly. They reassembled beyond the threshold and spoke in low tones. The researcher watched their retreating shapes and counted men who remained loyal to clerical secrecy. He did not assume defeat. He catalogued next moves. A short, sharp reveal then shifted the story's meaning. The deacon had an ally among the crowd. A merchant the researcher recognized from Chapter 1, someone who had purchased a lead amulet months before, stood up and denied any wrongdoing by the clergy. He claimed the ritual's protected order. The researcher turned to face him. "You sold those amulets to us," the merchant said. "We used them at market, for good measure. It is not the church's job to police private exchange. Did you sign a list?" "Marcus, I gave them to the church for safekeeping," the merchant said. "If that is wrong, tell us what to do with such items." The researcher: "Do not hand people's objects over as proof of guilt. Return what belongs to them. Do not use confession to mark citizens for removal." A pause followed as the crowd measured consequences. The deacon's cadre conferred in low voices. Marcus drew a ragged breath and then walked to the penitent and handed him the amulet. The penitent took it with shaking fingers and pressed it to his chest. When he drew back, the amulet's leather had left an imprint in the pad of his palm. He closed his fist around it and walked slowly away. The group's decision about the penitent's fate split the crowd into a rough consensus in favor of release. The penitent took a handful of supporters and left through the basilica's side tunnel. That release changed the stakes again. Ritual authority faltered. Clerical secrecy had lost its absolute claim. The deacon knew this and retreated. When the deacon left with his cadre, his voice carried a last thin threat. "This will be handled. Magistrates will be called. Order will be restored if magistrates are called." The researcher to Marcus: "We will carry these pages as proof. We will read names and show token marks. We will not let them rewrite ownership in private." Marcus nodded and, with a deliberate motion, removed his cloak and held it above his head. "This is mine," he said. "I will not let it become their property." Sister Aurelia came down from the steps and put her hand on the researcher's arm. Her fingers were clean but trembled slightly. "You saved a list," she said, "and the mark. That is a start." He looked at her and at Marcus and at the pile of wet vellum. He felt an equipment level change in the world. The ritual technology persisted, but now witnesses existed. The ledger's pages might be ruined, but the token matched the mark and names had been heard in the open. That concrete result altered what the researcher could do next. He catalogued what remained and made decisions. He would copy legible names onto new sheets. He would store the surviving sigil page in a hidden place. He would pursue the deacon's movements and trace where the lists had originated. The final twist came when, as they gathered evidence in the cloister, Marcus pointed out a name that matched a person the researcher had known years ago. A woman the researcher had once interviewed for a manuscript on penitential practice. The woman had vanished after a public penance. Her name now appeared adjacent to a small notation that read, "Record closed. Item transferred. That name, Marcus, is Livia. She lives in the Western Quarter." The researcher felt the last emotion shift in the chapter. Clarity turned into urgency toward a concrete goal. He could not let the ledger's method continue to claim lives and tokens. They walked out into a rain, slick cloister as noon turned to a cold afternoon. Sister Aurelia watched the basilica door where the deacon had disappeared. Marcus kept his hand inside his cloak where the amulet lay. The researcher slid the surviving sigil page from his satchel and tucked it beneath loose mortar behind a carved stone. He pressed the damp vellum into the crevice until only a corner remained exposed. He set a small pebble atop the gap, a physical seal. Aurelia touched his sleeve. "Will this stop them?" she asked. "Not alone," he said, "but it gives us proof. It gives us a method to hold them accountable." Paulus appeared at the far end of the cloister with two men who had not left the basilica. He looked for the ledger and for allies. He did not look toward the corner where the sigil page lay hidden. He approached with measured steps. "Brother Paulus, the researcher, no more lists kept secret. Return any items taken under compulsion." Paulus's mouth tightened. "You put the church under attack," he said. The researcher kept his posture calm. I put it under scrutiny. A knock sounded on the outer gate, hard, deliberate. The deacon's retreating cadre had not left a clean route. Someone had come with authority. The researcher and Aurelia looked at each other. Marcus tightened his fingers on the amulet. The closing paragraph must end on a concrete situational beat connected to the chapter events. The researcher pressed the pebble deeper, sealing the sigil page, and, as he closed his hand, a voice called from beyond the cloister. Open the gate. Magistrates demand entry. The researcher straightened and walked to the gate. He walked there with a ledger fragment folded in his palm and the amulet hidden in Marcus's cloak. He had proof, witnesses, and a concrete next step. Take what remained of the record to those who could force inquiry. His final action was simple and physical. He set the soaked page onto the gate's threshold and waited for the magistrate's footsteps to reach the stone. Emotion route. Suspicion had led him in. Emotion shifts suspicion to urgent action to doubt, doubt to anger, anger to clarity, shaped choices. The ledger's method was exposed, a token returned, the ledger damaged, a sigil page hidden, and the deacon's retreat signaled unresolved danger. The chapter resolved its immediate conflict. The forced stripping was interrupted, a ledger was lost to water, witnesses reclaimed tokens, and a surviving page was hidden for future proof. The final beat is concrete. The magistrates demand entry at the gate, and it connects directly to the decisions made in the baptistry.